And again, if you go global, affordable and reliable energy is directly correlated to human prosperity and flourishing. And you show me a desperately poor country or a population of people anywhere around the world, and I'll guarantee you lack of access to affordable and reliable energy is a primary cause.
When you look at all these other challenges and then you start talking about, hey, maybe we should take out some dams, it certainly raises some red flags. Welcome back to Dam, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. Today's guest is the general manager of Benton PUD, a tremendous voice for public power and hydropower, and I'm very excited for you, the listener, to get to know him. I got to know Rick about 3 years ago now at a little bit of a press conference that we set up, and it was actually, I think, maybe his first day on the job. And at the time, who knew that we'd be spending so much more time together talking about hydropower, the lower Snark River dams, all of our favorite topics. But here we are, and I'm very excited for him to be coming on. So, Rick, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Austin. And I remember that first day on the job very well. And, that was followed by COVID lockdown. So it was quite a illustrious beginning to my career as the GM.
Yeah, it was something that, at the time was kind of maybe something that might be happening, but nobody really knew for sure what was going on. And I think we have sort of the title for being one of the last public gatherings that happened for quite a while there in 2020. So first and foremost, let's just go ahead and set the stage for the folks who maybe aren't familiar. Could you give me kind of your elevator speech on who you are and how you wound up with Benton?
Yeah, you bet. And thanks for inviting me. So Benton PUD is located in Kennewick. We serve 57,000 meters in South Central Washington. And so for those who don't know, Kennewick is part of the Tri-Cities area, which is also includes the cities of Richland and Pasco. I like to think of myself, and I guess I am, a small town boy. I was actually born and raised in Benton County. I'm proud to say that I married my high school sweetheart. We've been married for 38 years. We made our way to Washington State University in Pullman when we first got married. I received a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering with a focus on power and control systems. And I kind of laugh, I think back, but power engineering was really not a popular major 36 years ago. Energy is a big deal now, but back then it wasn't so much. And but WSU had a great reputation with electric utilities in the Western US. And so there was lots of on-campus recruitment and opportunities for jobs. And I actually had several promising job offers, including one with Pacific Gas and Electric in San Francisco and Pacific Core in Portland, and one at the Salt River Project Power District in Phoenix, Arizona. And we decided to take that offer and we moved to the Valley of the Sun. And I live in Eastern Washington and it gets hot here and it's kind of a desert, but the real desert is down there and it's a lot hotter. And we love Phoenix. We really made some great friends there. But after about 2 years of relentless summer heat and then being a little bit homesick for the Northwest, I had a job opportunity that kind of dropped in my lap and we relocated to the Seattle area. So quite a shock to go from Phoenix to Seattle. I worked as a power system testing and commissioning engineer and as a consultant for a few years in Seattle. And then we had our first child and we found ourselves traveling over the Cascades back to Eastern Washington every time there was a birthday or some sort of special event, and kind of asked ourselves, well, why are we living in Seattle? And so I looked for a job in the Tri-Cities. I took the first one I could find. And like a lot of people in the Tri-Cities, I went to work at the Department of Energy Hanford site. After 3 years of that, I'd had enough. And eventually I ended up landing a dream job really at the Umatilla Electric Cooperative in Hermiston, Oregon. And I spent about 10 years there. And I'll tell you, I was really back in the industry that was really my first love. I always wanted to be in the utility industry and, working for a big utility to start out with. I was happy to find my way back into this industry. And then after UEC, I accepted a job at Benton PUD, and I've worked here now going on 16 years. And prior to becoming the GM, which is about 3 years ago, I directed our engineering and power management functions. and I was in charge of our broadband business for a number of years before that. So that might be a long elevator speech, but there you go.
Well, there's nothing wrong with a good long elevator ride as long as you're comfortable in one of those things. I'm glad that you ended up where you're at as well. I mean, we certainly enjoy having you over there, and I myself have become pretty familiar with Benton's service territory over the years as a local Northwesterner myself. And actually, this Saturday I was out there visiting some friends over in Benton City, and I love spending time out that way whenever I get the chance. But that's just me. So, in your own words, how would you describe the community that the PUD serves? And also, it sounds like your home as well for people that might be unfamiliar with that side of the state or that area.
Yeah, well, that's funny that you're visiting friends in Benton City, because that's where my wife and I grew up and graduated from high school. So
No kidding.
My hometown pretty well, it sounds like. Well, our community's very unique, and it's got an interesting history that's framed by a bit of a strange mix of industries, nuclear science and atomic bomb material production, operating in parallel with agriculture. So I'm not sure there's any other place in the U.S. that's like that. There might be. We're located at the confluence of the Snake and Columbia Rivers, so hydropower dams are obviously a big deal. And when you add the Columbia Generating Station nuclear plant just north of Richland and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, you can sum up our community as the place where energy, scientific research, and food production are happening in a big way. It's probably not the case anymore, but I remember one of our bragging rights used to be that we had more PhDs per capita of anywhere in the U.S. So I think we're still probably pretty strong in that area, but really proud of our heritage. There's a lot of pride in our community still in terms of helping keep America free, during World War II era and the Cold War, and the advancement of nuclear science that's happened here in the Tri-Cities. But it's obviously come at a price to the environment, and so the Hanford site, after the end of the Cold War, moved into the most complex environmental cleanup mission, maybe not on the planet, but it's got to be close to it. And with that comes a lot of federal dollars that still flow into our community. We're trying to emerge from that and kind of redefine our future, and I've been a part of that. But throughout it all, we've had really steady economic growth and a population increase for many years. I can tell you, I've been here, like I said, going on 16 years, and we've been through kind of recession periods, and we've been a little bit recession proof. We've had, even during the economic downturns, we've continued to grow, and our community's kind of fostered a really decent cost of living. It's a very livable community. One of the things I've noted is we really had a big improvement in healthcare services and a notable increase in retirees who find our cost of living to be attractive. And I think the abundant sunshine, access to rivers, golf, and wineries has kind of really reframed our community. And so it's been nice to see, these same attributes are really increasing tourism in our area too, which has been a nice addition. Kind of in summary, our biggest individual employers would be Pacific Northwest National Lab with about 4,500 employees. Cadillac Regional Medical Center is about 3,500 employees. And then Lamb Weston Food Processing is 3,000. And then the DOE Hanford site still represents over 9,000 jobs. So it's still a big part of it, but we are growing in other areas. And I'd say, finally, we're probably one of the most politically conservative areas in Washington, which can put us at odds with state policies for sure, and increasingly with federal policies, especially when it comes to energy and hydropower, right? Which you know very well. So.
Yeah, we will definitely be getting more into that hydropower topic here soon enough. And, when you also bring up some of the nuclear things, it crosses my mind that as much as there's some controversy that goes on from time to time with hydropower, I guess it's probably a good time to be in that area as opposed to maybe some of the Hanford stuff. So we're fortunate in that way. But you also touched on a lot of really great things about the area and about the community. And if you ever end up somewhere other than Benton PUD, the tourism department would probably benefit from some of your selling points there. And you mentioned geographically that you guys are pretty darn close to the Columbia and the Snake Rivers, and also the Yakima River too, for that matter. As far as some of those benefits go, what role do those rivers play in your area and maybe providing some of those benefits, whether it be the tourism or the different industries that have taken place there?
Yeah, and the standard answer is, of course, when you think about rivers, you got to think about dams in the Northwest. And the dams provide that kind of fundamental flood control, navigation for shipping goods and products in our community, and we're part of that. But the rivers are really what makes our area special and a great place to live and visit. The rivers provide recreation and fishing, obviously for local folks, but we're seeing more people from outside the area that want to enjoy the sunshine and the less crowded area. So they come over from the big city oftentimes, and we're happy to have them. And, I think the wine industry kind of makes for a nice package. But, with all these, those are all great, great impacts on our community. But the biggest impact from the rivers, from Benton PD's perspective, is, of course, hydropower. And then also what the rivers mean to irrigated agriculture. And so, just to kind of put it in context, if you take hydropower along with Columbia Generating Station nuclear, the electricity portfolio of the utilities serving the Tri-Cities, obviously including Benton PUD. And by the way, we're one of, it depends on how you look at it, 6 consumer-owned utilities that serve in and around the Tri-Cities. There's, 3 bigger ones and then co-ops on the outside. But, with that clean hydro and nuclear, we've got 95% non-carbon emitting power supply portfolio, which obviously puts us in the driver's seat when it comes to compliance with Washington State's 100% clean electricity law. Agriculture, for a long time has been a cornerstone industry in Benton and Franklin counties, of course, and employs lots of people, obviously has a big impact on the economy. And so obviously irrigated agriculture is a big deal. The top 5 agricultural commodities in our area, which people may kind of already know, but it's apples, potatoes, sweet corn, onions, and grapes. And like I said at the beginning, it's always kind of funny to talk about nuclear science and then you talk about food, a real fundamental and noble pursuit, right, to grow food. But the counties of Benton and Franklin are abundant producers of these crops, and they provide jobs and revenue for local farmers, vintners, and food processors. And so to kind of put it in context, I always talk about people who don't know the Tri-Cities. I say, well, it's usually kind of a drive-through on your way to somewhere else, unless you're coming here for some of the fun things that we talked about. But there's over 200,000 acres of irrigated farmland in Benton County alone. When people talk about acres, they talk about numbers, it's kind of hard to put it in context. So I love doing this. I looked it up, and that's the equivalent of about 4 Seattle's worth of land area. And that's just Seattle's land area, not including the water around there. So it's a big area. And if you either drive through or fly over, you see the big irrigation circles, the green with the brown background really stands out. But another interesting factoid about irrigated ag in Benton County, it's really unlike just about anywhere else in the world. And I only really thought about this over the last year or 2. But our farmers aren't just pumping vast amounts of water out of the Columbia River for ag. They're actually pumping it uphill. So when you go south of Benton County, you'll notice that there's a big ridge that you come over. That's the Horse Heaven Hills. But in some cases, our farmers are pumping water as much as 600 feet above the Columbia River elevation into those Horse Heaven Hills. So obviously that requires a lot of electricity. And so just to provide context, we're all probably still remembering the June 2021 heat dome event that really affected the Northwest. And during that heat dome event, Benton PD set a new record summer demand of 490 megawatts. And of that, 182 megawatts, or about 37%, was what we were needing to serve our irrigated ag. And so it's a big demand on our system. For further perspective, the irrigated ag electricity demand was equivalent to about 18% of the summer output of the Columbia Generating Station nuclear power plant. So, it kind of puts it in context. And then even though it's only for part of the year, irrigated ag starts cranking up in the springtime and peaks in the summertime and then trails off into the fall. It's still about 25% of the 210 average megawatts of annual electricity that we sell. And, the bottom line is without affordable and reliable electricity, irrigated ag would not be economical, and it just wouldn't happen in Benton County. and then kind of putting some final numbers on it. And I don't really, I didn't really have these off the top of my head, so I have to admit, I looked it up before I knew I was going to talk to you. But the total market value of Benton County ag products is over $1 billion per year. So it's a big deal. And then I can't mention ag without also talking about the wine, how the Tri-Cities fits into the Columbia Valley and kind of defines a wine region now that's become very, very popular. And it's often referred to as the heart of Washington wine country. And, I've been here a long time. And of course, I didn't pay attention when I was younger to wineries, obviously, for obvious reasons. But now there's over 160 wineries within a 50-mile radius of this area. And then another thing I have to mention about the rivers and their value is, I've got grandkids, and oftentimes we're down at Howard Amon Park in Richland, and we see the cruise ships come in, and so seeing the cruise ships on the Columbia and up into the Snake, I remember early on thinking, well, why would people want to come here, right? Because you don't really think about your backyard as a place for tourism. But the more, as I get older, I have a greater appreciation for the area and its beauty, its natural beauty. And so other people feel the same way. And so now it's great. We're hosting tourists from all over the world, frankly. And so rivers are a big deal, obviously.
Absolutely. It really is truly a unique area. Maybe on the surface it seems, a little drier than what people are used to on the west side. It's not quite as green all the time, right? But you won't really find anything like it anywhere else you go. And not to get off on too much of a tangent, but if you look at the history of how Eastern Washington even came to be, you can understand certainly why the landscape is the way it is and why it's unlike anything else you'll find in the world. And it's easy to take that for granted.
Yeah, and I'd sorry to interrupt you, but I agree with you. And I often have said this to people is that you really see our area from a totally different perspective when you're on the water, and so we had a boat when my kids were growing up. We were out water skiing and having fun on the river, and it's just amazing on a really hot July or August day how much relief you get, obviously, from it, but just how beautiful it really makes it. And and I know you've been on some of these tour boats that go up, out of the Columbia and into the Snake. And yeah, whenever we have visitors from outside the area, and I've been on boats with politicians from different parts of the country, they're always really amazed. And it truly is unique and beautiful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You also brought up something that was really interesting that, just kind of came to mind, and I thought we'd touch on it before we kind of get moving on to some of the other subjects. We talk a lot about the potential impacts of, say, the heat wave that you mentioned, where you have really high demand and you're needing to have enough energy to meet that demand. And the usual talking points you might hear would be something like, we have to worry about people's health and safety because of air conditioning, for example, or, the possibility that they could, lose the refrigeration for their food and also medications that they might rely on that depend on refrigeration. There's a lot of different factors at play there, but something that doesn't maybe ever get talked about by anybody until right now is the fact that if you were to compare it to, say, a situation that happened like in California last year, where they started asking people to reduce their energy usage in order to try and avoid some blackouts and things like that. Well, those irrigation systems, there's not a lot of room to play there. And that's a huge demand, as you mentioned. So, if you did have some reliability issues, the irrigation system would just be sort of, dead in the water if it goes down. And obviously that's a huge loss. So it's really interesting to think about that. I've never really considered, what that would do to the ability to pump that water up out of the river and keep those farms operating in those situations.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, because I do think people need to pay attention to that. And so yeah, and I'll tell you, obviously the farmers need a lot of water going into the growing season and then throughout the growing season. But a lot of times the hottest days will occur in late July and into August, and that's right when the farmers are getting ready to start to harvest. And so they've put in tens of millions of dollars worth of investment into these commodities. And by the way, they're competing in international markets. And so they're operating in pretty tight margins. And, the crop yields are everything to them. And to be interrupted during that period would be potentially catastrophic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've got some large corporate agricultural, enterprises, but we've got some other folks that are not so large, right? And so it's going to be a different risk for each of them. But I can tell you that during these last couple of summers, particularly with all of the press around blackouts and potential risk of targeted blackouts, even here in the Tri-Cities, our farmers were deeply concerned. And they, Benton PUD has developed a trusting relationship with those farmers, and they count on us. And when they start hearing about blackout risk and the possibility that they're not going to be able to get their crops to market, they get, obviously very concerned. And then they call me. And, I'm only in a position to control so much. There's things that are beyond my control. And so, I tell it to them straight. And I will tell you, I think we're okay right now, but I do worry. And we can talk a little bit more about specifics on that here in a minute. But people need to understand, that our food, and that's whether it's in Washington or California, for that matter, where you see California blackouts, it's a similar situation. And so electricity is fundamental to everything that makes life enjoyable and safe and healthy, and including our food supply.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And, while I don't want to camp out on the topic too long, I will say it's also something to consider as we talk about, possibly turning some of that farm equipment, say the tractors and combines and the different things used to harvest those crops, also into electric powered vehicles. I mean, it could really down the whole system. So, you brought up the policymakers and bringing people out on those tour boats as well. And that kind of leads us into that next topic, which I wanted to touch on. And that's that you personally have been on a bit of a mission to educate those folks and also to try and educate the public, even beyond your own service territory, about the importance of a reliable electric grid and what that requires. Could you maybe describe why it is that you personally have become so passionate about the topic in your role at Benton?
Yeah. Well, anytime I talk about reliability of the electric grid, I like to go global, because I think one of the things that I'm frustrated by it, but I'm also encouraged that there's a lot of people that they want to understand energy and electricity better, right? And I don't mean any disrespect by saying this, but there's a lot of energy ignorance out there, in the general public and with our elected officials. And, I've had the advantage of having this be my career. So obviously I'm close to it, and I have the ability to kind of share my expertise and experience and be credible somewhat. But it's very difficult to separate the politics from the science, and so you're right. I have been on a mission. I've been really fortunate to have some opportunities to talk to some folks. So if you go to the highest level and you really stop and think about this, and this goes to our kids today, right, in terms of their own energy ignorance, but energy is the industry that powers every other industry, right? And so access to affordable and reliable energy is like we just were talking about. It's about the health, safety, and well-being of people. And again, if you go global, affordable and reliable energy is directly correlated to human prosperity and flourishing. And you show me a desperately poor country or a population of people anywhere around the world, and I'll guarantee you lack of access to affordable and reliable energy is a primary cause. I mean, it's without exception. And I've heard some really interesting numbers that really puts things in perspective. There's over 3 billion people that use less energy than the average American refrigerator on an annual basis. So
Wow.
We have an energy scarcity problem. We sit here in Western civilization and we think, we got to cut back, and we got to reduce carbon. And it's like, well, keep things in perspective, because we have a large population on the planet that's still living in abject poverty, and it's largely due to the inability to access affordable energy. And they're going to they are using fossil fuels, whether we like it or not. There's also about 800 million people on the planet that don't have any electricity at all, which is also kind of a stunning number for people to process. So moving down from the global side of it, but I do think it's important as you're making policies, or you're supporting policies as somebody who's electing politicians, you need to understand that if it's truly a global issue we're dealing with, then you better have some global knowledge. But in the United States and even in the Northwest, we kind of take reliable electricity for granted, right? But maybe not so much with the California blackouts and the Texas blackouts in recent memory. But when you talk about my own personal passion, I'll tell you this: I have 3 boys, I have 5 grandsons, and I obviously want them to flourish and have a prosperous life, right? I mean, who doesn't want that for their kids? But I have to tell you a quick story about one of my grandsons. He was born here a couple of years ago, and I was down meeting him for the first time. They live down in Camas near Vancouver. And you may remember this, but there was an ice storm, snowstorm around the President's Day weekend. And this was like a month after my grandson was born. And before we got down there, and then while we were there, it was snowing and it was icy. And, when you bring that baby home for the first time, they're so vulnerable, and I've been through that myself, but here I am watching my son and his wife, going through that. And when it's deeply cold, like to the temperatures we're talking about in the 20s, or, over here, a lot of times it's in the teens, and you got a little baby, boy, you sure want to keep that heat on, right? You want to make sure that the traffic signals are working in case you got to go back to the hospital. You want the hospital to have electricity available so that they can take care of you or your baby if they need to. And so I remember thinking about, well, first of all, I was watching the news down there, and there was big power outages in Portland, and that happens, right? We all kind of experience that as these storms come and go. But people kind of, unless it's impacting you personally, you don't really think about it. But the point is, I'm close to it. I have people in my community who count on us, who trust us. And so, reliable electricity is not just it's not just about something being it's inconvenient. It's like it can be life and death, right? And I don't think I'm overstating it. And like I said before, reliable electricity, it impacts every aspect of our lives. Food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and education. We don't often think about that, but these countries and these populations of folks around the world, they don't even have access to basic education. They don't even have a light bulb to read by, So we can't take it for granted. We got to work hard to keep it reliable, but we also have to keep it affordable, and then do it with environmental concern also. So, and the other thing I'll say about reliable electricity in the Northwest particularly is when it comes to a reliable electric grid, we got to recognize the hydropower system in the Northwest is an absolute treasure. It's unlike anywhere else in the U.S. And a lot of these presentations, Austin, I know maybe you've seen my slide deck multiple times, but I show a picture of the different generation resources around the country. Coal, natural gas, nuclear, and hydro. And the Northwest just stands out, right? It's really, from a volume standpoint, it's like I said, it's like nowhere else. And it's the absolute foundation of our reliable electric grid here. And so, here we are, I'm sitting in Washington. Of course, I pay attention to what's going on in Oregon, but, it's clean energy policies like those in Washington and Oregon are really pushing us toward a rapid decarbonization of the grid and other sectors. Frankly, that's, I think, the biggest challenge obviously going to be with transportation and other industries. But that means the Northwest grid is going to depend even more on hydropower to keep the lights on, right? And I've got some more numbers and things that we can kind of work through, but I'll just leave it at that and just say, folks, make sure you understand that as we decarbonize, the hydropower system becomes even more important than it already is.
No, that is, I can't find any fault in that argument at all. I might be a little biased, but, the other thing too that, we always say here on our end of things is that you can't even compare our hydropower to other hydropower around the world, right? You look at some of the dams that go up in, say, South America or in Asia, or even some of the dams that are, in our own country. We've got a pretty interesting system up here, and it has very few flaws, if any, that you can really point out? I mean, we've got a pretty good thing going. So it's always important to make that distinction for folks that maybe are, trying to wrap their head around, what a dam is, right? In terms of, getting from that global level down to our regional level and talking about some of the challenges that we face here, we've touched on, I think, some of the different things that are impacted by grid reliability and potential risks to it. But for our region and for your service territory as well, what are some of the challenges that we face when it comes to reliability moving forward, and what could, upset some of the balance that we have now?
Yeah, so to be really direct for our region, it's all about the impact of coal plant retirements, which are going to top around 4,000 megawatts by 2025. And, it's probably because I have a bias because I live in the Tri-Cities, but well, what does 4,000 megawatts look like, And so the Columbia Generating Station nuclear plant is just over 1,000. So, 1,100, 1,200 megawatts. So that's like retiring 4 of those, major facilities. And then the problem is we don't really have dependable replacements lined up for that. And, as much as I love hydropower, and I do, make no mistake about it, it is still a variable resource, right? It's still subject to the timing of water flow and the volume of flow that we get in the rivers. So let me put it in further context. When Oregon and Washington clean energy policies take natural gas off the table as a logical replacement for coal, which they essentially have done, there's prohibitions in Oregon on building new natural gas plants, and then there's financial penalties that are really crippling in Washington. So for all practical purposes, we're not going to be able to replace coal with natural gas. Now, I advocated for a more rational, what I thought was a more rational transition away from coal, because natural gas is 50 to 60% cleaner burning than coal. We could gain a lot of ground on emission reduction, but we could, keep the grid reliable, which I think is not a bad thing to do. But oh no, we're not going to do that. We're gonna really essentially take it off the table. And so here's another fact that a lot of people don't know, but as a part of some studies that were done in the run-up to the passage of the Clean Energy Transformation Act in Washington, and so we worked with a consulting company called Ep.3, and they're well known throughout the region. But anyway, in that Ep.3 study, we were looking at least cost approaches to carbon reduction in the electricity sector, and then what is it going to take to do that and keep the grid reliable. And it's kind of the first time I'd really thought about it, but coal and natural gas have historically represented about 1/3 of the nameplate generating capacity in what I'll call the expanded Northwest grid footprint, which kind of moves into Utah, kind of Western Wyoming, and then Eastern Montana. But if you look in that footprint, it's about 1/3 of the nameplate generating capacity is from fossil fuels, coal and natural gas. Now, even though they're 1/3 of the nameplate, they actually provide about half of the effective capacity. And so effective capacity in the simple terms it's how much electricity generation can be counted on when the demand is at its highest levels. Of course, peak demand happens on the coldest and hottest days of the year. And in the case of winter, it's in the morning when the sun's not shining and in the evening when the sun's not shining, which creates a problem, obviously, if you're going to try to replace generation resources with solar. And then, of course, wind, it's kind of here and there. But people they really need to understand the scale of energy supply and how much we rely on each type of technology. And so in that same footprint that I just described, just to put it in context, the maximum electricity demand, and it's kind of getting close to being winter and summer peaking are kind of about the same, is about 55,000 megawatts plus or minus. So, and a megawatt doesn't mean a whole lot to folks until you put it in context. But like I said, Columbia Generating Station, about 1,100 megawatts or so. So you can kind of get a picture that 55,000 is big. And by the way, the peak demand in California during their big, during the September heat wave last year, it was about 60,000 megawatts. And I don't want to digress, but just again, putting it in context, that's a lot of generation required, okay? And so of that 55,000 peak demand, hydropower covers about 20,000 megawatts of the demand. and coal and natural gas combined for as much as 25,000 megawatts. So you can't just wish away coal and natural gas. You got to have a solid plan to replace them. And for my chair, we don't. We're kind of throwing the wind and solar kitchen sink at the problem and hoping it'll stick and that we can muddle through. And like I said earlier, when you go and shut down coal plants without a plan to replace them with dependable capacity, based on the numbers I just shared with you, hydro, again, becomes very, very important, right, by the numbers. And so whenever I talk about grid reliability, I also emphasize the fundamentals. And this has been kind of I had one guy say, wow, that's an inconvenient truth after I shared this. But I said, one of the fundamental principles for grid level electricity is that electricity is simultaneously produced, transmitted, and consumed, which you can't really say about any other commodity, right? And the balance of supply and demand has to be maintained at all times. So it's non-negotiable. It's the laws of physics. So when you talk about the intermittency of variable wind and solar, which are being promoted by federal and state politicians in particular as replacements for coal and natural gas, it's not just an inconvenience that they don't operate when the sun doesn't shine or when the wind doesn't blow. It's the difference between having a reliable power grid and blackouts. It's just that simple. And so I said earlier, it's hard to separate the politics from the science, but when you really stop and take a breath and get out of your political camp and just talk to like an engineer like me, and I hope I've opened some people's eyes, and I think I have. I've had some people give me some feedback that we got to get out of the political battles over this and really look for some common ground. And I won't go down that trail, but I think the common ground could be advanced nuclear technology, which we can talk about kind of in the closing remarks. But to kind of close out, the concerns I have, put things in further context. So when you think about I'll call it the deficiency of wind and solar, which it clearly is, right? If you have to have moment-to-moment balancing, there is a deficiency. The question is, can you put a number to it, so that people can get out of the political battles and into a more realistic assessment of what we're facing? And the answer is, yeah, you can do it. And so how much generating capacity can be expected to show up at the times of maximum demand on the grid? I mentioned this before, is referred to as effective capacity. And so the effective capacity of coal and natural gas and other thermal generation from the perspective of wide area, geographically diverse grid operations is on the order of 98 to 100% effective. So it's basically, you got enough inventory of those resources and you can bet the farm on it, it's going to show up. But the effective capacity of wind and solar in the Northwest, which was just recently, last fall, calculated by the Western Resource Adequacy Program effort, which is being promoted by the Northwest Power Pool, which is now the Western Power Pool. They ran the numbers and they kicked out some preliminary numbers. And without going through each of them, I'll just say that the effective capacity of wind and solar is in the range of 2% to 30%, depending on the technology and geographical location. You can imagine solar's kind of low on the scale because in the Northwest, we have problems with weather inversions and our cold temperatures happening when the sun doesn't shine. And so wind kind of tends to be in the range of as low as 8% in Washington State to as much as 30% or even 30 to 35% in Montana. So it really depends on where you're at. But no matter how you slice it, there's a long way between 98 to 100% effective capacity and 2% to 30% effective capacity. So the people say, okay, well, what does that translate to? What does it look like to try to replace dependable coal with wind and solar? Okay, so let's frame it a little further. 1,000 megawatt wind farm would occupy about 140 square miles of land based on kind of averages that I've found. It would deliver about 300 average megawatts of annual energy, right? So capacity factor people talk about is really just the average energy on an annual basis based on the maximum nameplate capability. So about 300 average megawatts from a 1,000 megawatt wind farm. But from an effective capacity standpoint, it would only deliver between 80 and 300 megawatts. So that 8% to 300 range, I'm sorry, 8% to 30% range. So just simple math. So you get 80 to 300 megawatts of effective capacity from a 1,000 megawatt wind farm, depending on where it's located geographically. And I certainly don't want to exclude, like Montana wind is definitely far better in some respects. But the point is this, is to replace the dependable capacity that is provided by coal, and then somewhere down the road that is also provided by natural gas. If you're looking to replace that, it would require a massive overbuild, right? Because you're going to need 140 square miles for every 1,000 megawatts of wind. And nobody's talking about just wind. We're talking about all these, wind and solar combined. But the point is, it's very land intensive, no matter how you slice it. So then that brings up the question about development friction. And are you really going to be able to spread wind and solar farms all over creation in order to multiply its low effective capacity to a level that approximates what you're getting from a coal plant? And I would argue that it's infeasible. It's impractical and infeasible, especially when you look back at the 22 to 25,000 megawatts of fossil fuel, of coal and natural gas that are providing reliable electricity in the West. So hopefully I didn't lose folks, but the bottom line is it takes a lot of land just for the farms. And then the other complication that comes in is, well, where are wind and solar farms located? It's not where people live. It's in rural areas, including in our backyard here in Benton County, where the largest wind farm in Washington State is being proposed. Very controversial project, by the way, which I've been very vocal about. But
I heard an earful about it on Saturday.
Setting that aside for a moment, you still have the issue of building transmission lines. And you hear our federal politicians and our state politicians, insisting that we have to fast track a lot of transmission line construction across the entire country, right? And, as a power engineer with 36 years in the business, I can tell you, nobody really wants power lines in their backyard. I can say locally you don't. And then when it comes to, lines across the state or across state lines, it's a very long and arduous process to get a power line sited. The best one, case in point right now is the Boardman to Hemingway 500 kV transmission line that's been, on the radar of utilities since the early 2000s and kind of got serious in the mid 2000s. And now here we are in 2023, and they still haven't turned a shovel of dirt. So, and we're hopeful and we're optimistic, I think, now that it's probably going to get done, but it's probably going to be like 2026 before it gets done. So, you're going to spread these wind and solar farms all over creation, and then you're going to count on the fact that you're going to be able to fast track transmission lines construction, which has never been the case, right? And then to make it further complicated, we really live in an anti-development era, right? We're not really interested in tearing up the land, but yet we're being told the best strategy for clean energy is wind and solar and transmission lines. So, and I've got more to say about that, but let me wrap it up by saying, back to these E3 studies that I was a part of. We ran some simulations of, what would it look like to meet 100% clean electricity requirements in Washington or Oregon? And by the way, that's a theoretical possibility. It's not, we weren't saying it could even be done physically. But if it could, and you kept all the hydro that we have now in place, right? Don't diminish it, don't do anything to it. The amount of wind and solar that you would have to install across the Northwest, the 4 Northwest states, would consume a land area that's between 20 and 100 times the area of Portland and Seattle combined. So when we think about clean energy futures, it can't be some vague notion, right? It's got to be a bit more precise than that. You got to get people dialed into, well, what's it going to look like? And what is the probability you're going to be able to do it on the timeline that politicians are insisting it must be done on? And I can just tell you from a practical standpoint, it isn't going to happen at the pace that folks think it's going to have to happen. What we're going to need is a technology breakthrough. I think advanced nuclear is one of those technology, I call it a breakthrough, but yet advanced nuclear has been around for a long time. But getting things like small modular reactors on the table, I think, is going to be, really important. And unfortunately, when you kind of operate on a vague notion of a clean energy future that doesn't really seriously consider the land use impacts and the environmental impacts and the life cycle impacts of what I would argue are some of the most material intensive technologies on the planet, right? Wind and solar are not environmentally benign. They have a real life cycle impact. They take a lot of raw materials, in addition to the land. And then there's the issue of recycling on the back end. And so anyway, I think I say this a lot, in Washington and Oregon, our clean energy policies have really boxed utilities into a corner. And recently I've been saying too, it's like, well, politicians are designing the grid, and I guess that's what people want because we keep electing folks that have this kind of view. And so here I am as a utility executive and engineer, trying to make the best of what we have. And and then I say, okay, it'd be hard enough if we just were trying to replace coal and natural gas with wind and solar. But then we have politicians in Washington and Oregon who are actively advocating for the diminishment of the hydropower system, which I already showed by the numbers and by common sense is the key, it's the backbone to our reliable, clean, affordable power grid. But now we have, again, our state leadership, actively advocating for excessive spill of water to support outmigration of salmon. And I do think it's excessive. And so when the water is spilled over the dam, it's not making electricity. And so there's a consequence to that. Of course, obviously the big elephant in the room is the lower Snake River dams. And, our governor continues to advocate for outright removal along with the state of Oregon. And so you can see why I sit here and shake my head some days. And so that's kind of regional. And then Austin, I've been blabbing on here, but I'll just dial it into to Benton PD. So I can sit here and theorize and talk about all these things and throw numbers out, but it is consequential to Benton. And so Benton PUD, our maximum demand for electricity, as I mentioned before, happens in the summertime, and it happens kind of in an unusual way. It creates these very seasonal deficits, and the irrigation load. If you can imagine what a sombrero looks like, with a big middle in it, and then it's got the two sides to it. A lot of utilities have their winter and summer peaks, and they look kind of symmetrical. Well, we have this big blob in the middle that we love our big irrigators, but it creates a big summertime demand. And so our current power supply contract that we have with Bonneville Power Administration gives us rights to a percentage of the generation that's happening in the federal Columbia River power system, which includes the dams plus Columbia Generating Station. But our contract says you get a certain percentage of the generation that's actually happening hour to hour. If that percentage is more than you need, then we can sell it, and then we buy down our power costs by selling it. If it's not enough and we're deficient, then we need to buy market power. And so now you got to think about, so Benton doesn't have a deficit that's like annual, it's very seasonal. And so what we need is reliable, dependable capacity that can show up in the summertime, like very specifically. And so to kind of cut to the chase, that the acquisition of market purchases is becoming very risky, right? As you're shutting down dependable capacity, then the inventory of available market purchases starts to go down. And so Benton, we've become very concerned over the last couple of years with the passage of CETA and then the Oregon clean energy legislation. So we began looking for ways to try to firm up our potential deficits, right? Which are also variable, not just on the weather, but also on hydro. So we had those, kind of a double whammy. So to make a long story short, one of the strategies that I employed was to reach out to the Bonneville Power Administration and ask them, can we convert the contract we have now to what is referred to as a load following contract, where Bonneville would cover our load shape, right? They would just take care of it. And they were not required to say yes, but after vetting it with the region, and then there was actually 5 other utilities that joined us in the ask. And so there were 6 utilities that asked. And then 3 of us actually chose to convert. And so Benton will be converting to a load following contract in October of this year. And so we're betting on the hydro system, right? And we're betting on Bonneville because Bonneville has the ability, if they're short, to take care of their customers. So I hope that makes sense. And so when I talk about my concerns with clean energy policies, those concerns translate to real business decisions that we've had to make. And so we made one, and we're very grateful for the opportunity that Bonneville's given us. And then I guess I want to wrap up by saying if folks were reading the papers, maybe they saw that here during the heat dome event that the Tri-Cities area had a risk of, quote, rolling blackouts, and it was actually characterized incorrectly. And so when you think about blackout risk, there's at least a couple of categories. One would be generation deficiencies, right, where you don't have enough generation, and that was not the case. So that was not the case in the Tri-Cities, but the Tri-Cities transmission system. And so Bonneville Power owns about 75% of the transmission system in the Northwest, and they own virtually all of it around the Tri-Cities. And to cut to the chase, we've had a lot of growth in this area, and with some new NERC, which is North American Electric Reliability Corporation standards, which are reliability standards that came into play over the last few years, Bonneville recognized that the transmission system in the Tri-Cities is actually deficient during contingency conditions, which would be take the normal system with all the lines in service and all the substations in service and take one of those line segments out of service. Well, if that happens during summer peak demand, which in the Tri-Cities is like about 1,300 megawatts of total electricity demand. If a contingency happens during that, then they would need to potentially call on local utilities for localized blackouts. So that's what was happening. That's what was in the news. Bonneville has begun work on improving the transmission system in our area. They have a major investment in mind, over $100 million, none the least of which is going to go toward a major substation interconnection on a big 500,000 volt transmission line that's kind of out here southwest of Kennewick, and bring another source of electricity into the Tri-Cities. The Tri-Cities is served by about I'd call it three major corridors of transmission, from the north, from the east, and from the south. And what this would do is put a source to the west. And so we're happy that they're doing that, but we are literally each summer as we get to peak demand periods, we're on guard. We're kind of put on notice that, as long as the system stays together, we should be okay, but that's not a great place to be. And so we're looking forward to the day when they finish the improvements. Their schedule right now is to finish things up somewhere around 2025, 2026 to get the big improvement done. And so between now and then, we're kind of crossing our fingers.
Yeah, and I'm really glad also that you painted the picture that you did, because there is so much to consider here. And you discussed the wind and solar situation, and there is sort of the question of, well, could you support some of that with batteries as well to try and at least increase the reliability, although that certainly doesn't answer the land use questions. But there's the pressure to get that coal offline and get the natural gas next. And at the same time, there's some of the pushback and the concern around nuclear, for example. People are a little bit apprehensive, even with the new small modular technology, that, hey, it's got that nuclear word in there, and we're not sure how we feel about that. And actually today, as we're recording this, the newest episode of this podcast is just dropped, which is on pump storage. And there's also, as exciting as that technology is, and as much as we're supporters of it, there are the siting challenges that come up with that as well. So you start looking all around and you see that, you have these different challenges. And at the same time, to quote, I don't remember who said it, but it's one of my favorite quotes, and I use it often. This idea that you can't legislate technology into existence, and that when we talk about the push towards making these clean energy transitions and getting onto renewables, that some of the challenges that we have for providing that energy aren't answered with the current slate of technologies available to us, which then puts you in a situation where if you do want to meet those goals, you might be relying on hoping, crossing your fingers that a technology comes to existence that we don't currently have. So there's a lot of different challenges there. And then that really ties into, I think, where, we'll spend the last portion of this podcast, which is, the reason that, for example, you and many other utilities and folks out there in the Tri-Cities area are defenders of hydropower, right? when you look at all these other challenges and then you start talking about, hey, maybe we should take out some dams, it certainly raises some red flags. And that's pretty valid once you understand the entire spectrum of challenges that are facing us as we move forward here. And as you said yourself, we can't exactly put our energy on pause, right? So as we speak, we have to meet these demands.
Yeah, you've given me some thing. I can kind of help wrap things up. I think I've obviously expressed some frustration with the Washington and Oregon policies, but when you really look at it from a national perspective, we're already a clean energy leader by far. I mean, we are so far ahead of other states that it pains me to watch us push ourselves to the cliff of grid reliability, right? I mean, we're kind of walking up to this cliff, and there's really no practical reason for it, right? And the clean energy model that we think we're producing in Washington, when you stop and think about it, cannot be exported anywhere else in the country, right? Because we're fundamentally, in the case of Washington State, 60% hydro already, and 70% clean when you add nuclear and the wind that we already have, right? So we already have this 70% clean portfolio, and everybody says, yeah, great, but then we're gonna be an example for the rest of the country. But I'm sorry to tell you that there's no other place in the country where 60% of your electricity portfolio comes from hydro. The rest of the country is predominantly a coal and natural gas. It's coal and natural gas that supply most electricity. Nuclear, I think it's like 20%. But it just kind of flattened out for obvious reasons, which we don't have time to get into. But the point is that we're a fossil fueled nation. 80% of primary energy comes from fossil fuels. So that transcends electricity, right? It's all sectors. So 80% fossil fueled. It's taken us 100 years to get to that point. And the idea that we're going to somehow shut that down in 10 years or even 20 or 30 years is just infeasible. It's not possible. Okay, no matter what. That's oh well, Rick, you could be wrong. Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just telling you, just think it from a practical standpoint. So as you think about the volume of energy, I mentioned at the very beginning, it's really important to understand that after multiple decades and trillions of dollars in worldwide subsidies for wind and solar power, these are energy dilute technologies, meaning they don't produce a whole lot of energy on a square foot of land, right? They really don't. And so after all those subsidies and all these years, from a primary energy standpoint, which is the key, right? Because if it's a global CO2 issue, that transcends all sectors. But from a worldwide standpoint, wind and solar represent 3% of primary energy. And in the United States, they represent 5%. So just think about it, folks. How are you going to move from 5% in the US to some 100%, which is just absolutely infeasible in rapid fashion, with technologies that have so many deficiencies? The intermittency and reliability is just one of them, but the energy density is a huge problem. So when people hear me talk, sometimes they say, well, what's your plan? And I say, well, I've been saying it for a long time. Of all the states and all the regions in the country that can afford to be sensible, measured, and more compromising maybe in balancing affordability with reliability and being environmentally responsible, it's our region. We could do it. Because of hydro, we're in the driver's seat, okay? And so what I've argued is replace coal with natural gas. It's a good transition. You gain 50 to 60% reduction in CO2 emissions. If you look at national CO2 emissions, by the way, across all sectors in the United States, our emissions have gone down since the mid-2000s. And the reason they've gone down primarily is because the electricity sector has had a serious reduction in CO2 emissions precipitated by fuel switching from coal to natural gas. And so we've moved from, I think the number was about 2.5 gigatons or so in the mid 2000s to about 1.5 gigatons in the electricity sector because of fuel switching predominantly. I think it's about 60% attributed to switching to natural gas. And then of course, wind and solar provide additional benefit, no doubt, but the real driver is fuel switching. So in the Northwest, we could go coal to natural gas, keep your hydro system in place, and then move forward with advanced nuclear technologies, which offer something that people don't talk about enough. With energy density comes the ability to produce a lot of electricity on a small footprint, right? Well, with the advanced nuclear technologies that are out there today, the small modular reactors, one of the things people need to recognize is the safety boundary around these new technologies is at the fence. Okay, so they're so safe, they're intrinsically safe. They use laws of physics to shut down safely and require no operator intervention. Okay, those technologies could conceivably be located where people live, right? Instead of in rural areas that require lots of transmission line construction, you could build SMRs in Seattle, in and around Seattle and Portland, down the West Coast and all the major metropolitan areas. So that's an opportunity that if we don't see that and take advantage of it, it's going to be really sad for me. I'm not going to be around much longer in terms of my career. I'm going to work my way. I'm going to try my best to try to get people to understand it. But I hope people understand what I'm saying there, that you can connect the dots. We could keep the grid reliable, and we could keep it moving toward a reduced carbon output on a real sensible trajectory without risking the health, safety, and well-being of the people who count on it right now. So hopefully that makes sense. And I try every chance I get to get politicians and even my fellow utility folks to stop operating in this vague clean energy future and really boil it down to what does it look like, right? And what is feasible and sensible given our position we're in now, what the United States is really doing already, in spite of, it's not because of Paris Climate Accords that we've reduced emissions, because technologies are getting better and they're switching. And you've got to keep the global perspective in mind. And I don't want to jump back too much to global, but as we sit here and make these decisions and kind of ask ourselves, well, am I willing to come to the table and compromise? I ask people this question. There's 36,000 million metric tons of CO2 emissions emitted around the world across all sectors every year. So 36 gigatons. China emits 12,000 million metric tons, so 12 gigatons, and increasing every year. And why are they doing that? Because they're digging themselves out of poverty. And you're not going to convince leaders of countries where poor people live to stay poor. You're going to keep poor people. You're not going to convince poor people to stay poor. Okay, keep it in mind, folks. The same is true in India. The same is true in Latin America. So the CO2 emissions globally are going to be driven by people living in developing countries, not by the United States or by Western civilization. So we can cripple ourselves with energy dilute, unreliable technologies, try to shove batteries into the equation to make it work. And I can guarantee you the cost will go up, because now you're taking individual technologies like reliable coal and reliable natural gas, and you may hate them all you want, but you're trying to replace them with technologies that can never do it, not by themselves. They can't. And so now you multiply the capital cost up front. And so there's going to be a natural increase in cost to do it. So the affordability becomes a problem in addition to reliability problems, right? So hopefully that's making sense. But even in California, and I say this about the Northwest, minus hydro, we're just California, okay? And what do I mean by that? So when California had their peak demand period in September last year, I told you earlier, that was about 60,000 megawatts of electrical demand. Of course, they were asking people not to charge electric vehicles, turn up your thermostats and all that. But people need to understand that there was over 30,000 megawatts of natural gas online to keep their grid reliable, okay? In addition to that, they were importing a lot of electricity from the Northwest. And where was that electricity coming from? It was a big chunk of it was hydro, including the lower Snake River dams. And if I remember the number right, it was somewhere around, I think, 1,200 to 1,500 megawatts just from the Snake River dams. But California's grid depends on hydro and depends on natural gas. It depends on these reliable technologies. In spite of all the press they get for the big solar play, which they certainly have made, they've kind of crippled themselves a little bit, right? And then to add insult to injury, electricity rates in California are heading on a retail level to over 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's not me just saying it, go look it up. And so their model is what we're being told is the model we should all emulate. That same model, by the way, has already been tried. It's already been done in Europe. It's already been done in Germany. And every time it ends with increased cost for electricity, degraded reliability, but somehow we're led to believe that we're going to do it differently and we're going to make it all work. And I just tell people, just get yourself educated, hold elected officials more accountable. I don't have all the answers, but we have to be willing to talk about the fundamental fact that every energy conversion technology has environmental impacts. You know, you can't say that some have only side effects and they're all bad. I mean, fossil fuels lifted humanity out of a pretty substandard life, right? Around the turn of the century, you lived to be about 32 years old, and now we live to be between 72 and 80 something, you know, depending on where you're at. That's been proportionate to CO2 emissions and in the Industrial Revolution. And you can't dismiss that, right? Because it's politically popular. You want to kind of put yourself on moral high ground. We got to be more balanced in our view. And hopefully we'll get the political folks and the people who elect them kind of all singing off the same sheet music here. I am a little afraid that, you know, the damage is going to be done to some degree. And I hope we can pull up before it, you know, really gets critical.
You know, I'll also just say quickly as a quick little anecdote that, you know, when you bring up California, I did live down there for a very brief period of time, which, you know, is a bit tough as a Northwesterner, not only because you have to get used to the constant hot and dry weather, which, you know, we don't often get here, but we also, I think, paid about $500 to $600 a month in energy costs each month. So, you know, for people that haven't experienced that, man, that is a big wake up. But to bring it to kind of bring it back to a local point, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, as you called it earlier, the lower Snake River dams. We know after several years now of going through these different processes and different scientific discoveries and whatnot that there's definitely a hefty price tag that would come with potentially removing those facilities. And it's no secret that Northwest River Partners is a big supporter of keeping the lower Snake River dams in place. But that only speaks to the Northwest as a whole. For Benton PUD specifically, what impact would breaching those dams have on your area? And you know, obviously this whole discussion plays into the much larger discussion that we've had today about energy and reliability and where we're going.
Yeah, you know, since we're basically out of time, I'll give you the shortest answer I can. Whenever I talk about impacts to Benton or the local utilities here in the Tri-Cities, I have to remind people that the Snake River dams, along with all of the federal Columbia River Power System dams, which I think is like 31 total, are all in the power supply portfolio of over 130 utilities across the Northwest. So this is not just about, you know, surplus generation resources that the region can do without, and, you know, we'll just sacrifice them. I always like to point people back to the fact that no, these are owned by the preference customers of the Bonneville Power Administration, not some ubiquitous, nameless utility that can afford to lose them, right? We can't afford to lose them. They represent 10% of all of our portfolios, not just Benton, but everybody's. You say, oh, 10%. It's like, well, 10% is a big deal when you're also working against the limitations that the clean energy laws have put on us, right? So there's technology that's being taken off the table. So it's 10% of annual energy, but it's also, the Snake River dams are an important part of the reliability. And I've said this many times, but Snake River dams provide up to 25% of Bonneville's operating reserves, which I like to say is blackout insurance, right? They have the ability to flex their output up and down based on electricity demand in the supply demand balancing act that the grid has to do, right? And the Snake River dams are 25% of that blackout insurance. And so you can't get that from wind and solar, right? I've talked about effective capacity. So it would impact the reliability. And I think obviously irrigated ag would be hurt in the Tri-Cities. Our farmers that farm in Benton County also farm in Franklin County, some of them. So, you know, there's interest there. You know, I mentioned jobs, tourism, and just the livability of our community would obviously suffer. And then from the bigger picture, we have to think about this and say, would Snake River Dam breaching just be the beginning of the end of hydropower, really, over the long term? And I don't want to overstate it, but if it's okay to breach the Snake River dams, then where do you stop? And I also think that when you diminish hydropower production, you also open the door for increasing spill on all the other dams, right? Which says, well, we can do without the Snake River Dam, so let's really increase the spill at the rest of them. And when you do that, you diminish the generating capability to really low levels that cannot really be replaced. Definitely not, quickly. And so, even though you may not outright breach the dams, I think the Snake River Dam issue is an indicator of kind of the trend that we need to avoid at all costs. And I want to say, I'm still learning more and more about salmon science every day. But the thing that really stands out to me that just should make people pause is some of the work that Northwest River Partners has done in conjunction with Dr. David Welch in looking at all the rivers across the Northwest and into Alaska, and looking at the ratio of the small fish that are going out to the ocean to live, and what that ratio is compared to the large salmon that come back to go spawn. And that's called the smolt adult ratio, or SAR number. And when you look at the SAR number for all the rivers in the Northwest, just looking at it objectively and dispassionately on a map, which I know River Partners put together, and I've used it in a lot of presentations, you can see that the SAR numbers, which, by the way, scientists say need to be in the 2 to 6% range, which we can debate that, whether that's sustainable with modern civilization. But let's just use that, as a standard, because that's what they're holding the Snake River dams to. But there's very few rivers that are delivering a 2 to 6%, right? Even rivers that are undammed are struggling. And so the ocean conditions seem to be the common thread. And I just hope people will pause, be less emotional about things, because we're all in this together, right? I mean, we're all, and I really wish in the salmon debate we could just get to the point where we could look at each other's common humanity and say, okay, the dams are here. We have these energy challenges. We have these policies that we have to work with. And in order for us to have a balanced solution, there's going to have to be a little bit of give and take. But as utility representatives, we don't really have anywhere else to turn, right? I mean, so we got to be really convinced that dam breaching is, the only way forward before, we would give into that. And I don't think there's adequate evidence. There's clearly not, in my mind. And my final words will be this: as a utility guy, we cannot afford to be myopically focused on carbon reduction. I've already said that. We have to balance the three-legged stool: affordable, reliable, and environmentally responsible. And if we fail on any of those, we will be held accountable, not the politicians and not the lobbyists who are pushing for more and more wind and solar. I will tell you that. And so that's why I push hard. That's why every chance I get to talk, I do. And thank you, Austin. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And as a comms guy, I'll quickly say that I also appreciate you thinking about that, because we're often the ones that when things do fall back on the utility, we get to hear about it and try to navigate through that. So you're saving somebody quite the headache if you can avoid that. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, sincerely, I think that this has been a really good discussion, and I think that people listening with an open mind are going to have a lot of things to think about after today, and a lot of things to really look into deeper, and they'll have a much better understanding of the issues, but they'll also have a lot more to ponder. So that's a really good one. And also I'll say too that, we didn't get to spend too much time jumping into some of the salmon stuff, but I know that you've been a big student of that lately. And so I think maybe down the road we might be having a future discussion here on dam to talk about some of the salmon science as well, and what you've been learning there. So with that, I do have one that I have to surprise you with. It's unfortunately you being our second guest here on the podcast, and the first episode dropping as we're recording this, you wouldn't have had the time to know that this would be coming. So I do have one last question that I like to ask everybody. It's a question that I do because I want people to get to know you, right? We get to talk about a lot of the issues and everything, but I also want people to know the personality behind our guests. And so if you could just maybe leave everybody with one piece of advice today, and it doesn't have to be about the topics we discussed. It doesn't have to be about energy or PUDs or anything at all, but maybe just a good encouraging word of advice to leave people on as we close this one out.
Wow. That's a big order. I think, and I've got it here right in front of me, is when I took over as general manager for Benton PUD, one of the things that we talked about as an executive team is the importance of valuing people. We all have functional requirements in our lives through our jobs and just through raising families and what have you. And you can sometimes you lose track of the inherent value of all human beings, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race. And so I said this earlier, as we're tackling these really difficult problems, I just want people to know sincerely that, I struggle like everybody else, but I really want to demonstrate, respect and regard for the just inherent value of all people through our words and actions. And that's something I think you have to put in the forefront of all you do. And I've been very fortunate. I feel very blessed by the career that I've had. I told you about, the beginning days, 36 years ago. I've had a wonderful life. I'm very grateful. Energy's a part of it. But when it really comes down to it, it's what you say and what you do every day that's really going to have a lasting impact. And that's how I try to live my life. And I wish we could have more of that as we're working through some of these very challenging issues.
Absolutely. I think it's a great reminder. It's something that we're always trying to practice, but it's not always easy when you get into some of these messier topics. But I think that's a really great one to close out on. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for making the time. And I think that this is off to a great start, not only for the podcast, but for just what we're trying to accomplish here as a whole. I'm really glad that you could be on today.
Thank you, Austin. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you down the road.
Thank you. Take care. That'll do it for this third episode of Damn. We're only 3 episodes into this thing, but I consistently find that these podcasts fly by because there's simply so much to discuss. I suppose it's a good thing that there are many more of these in the works. Speaking of things in the works, Rick mentioned one of our favorite salmon biologists, Dr. David Welch. And while I can't make any promises, we do hope he can join us for one of these things in the not-so-distant future. So, stay tuned for that. Look, today's discussion didn't shy away from topics that can be political, controversial, and divisive in nature, and I get it. In the age of social media, so-called culture wars, and the desire to implement renewable energy at a rapid pace, it's easy to get hung up on things like nuclear, fossil fuels, and the potential that we might not be able to solve all of our issues with popular technologies like wind and solar. You might even be put off by the idea of preserving our hydropower system, though you did voluntarily listen to a podcast called Damn with an exclamation point, right? I'm kidding, of course, and if that's you, hey, look, I'm glad you tuned in anyways, and I hope you'll continue to do so. Ultimately, I hope Rick's words didn't go over your head when he pointed out that grid reliability doesn't have to be political or controversial, nor should it be. Instead, the numbers and concerns he outlined today should, if nothing else, get you thinking about energy policy and where we go from here as we confront these difficult realities. Hopefully today's discussion at least provides some greater context as to why we're such strong supporters of our hydropower system and why we don't want to see productive dams removed anytime soon. Or maybe you listen to this whole thing and you're just excited to go tasting some wineries over in Rick's neck of the woods, and we can't blame you for that either. No matter where you landed at the end of this one, I appreciate you listening as always, and I hope you'll continue to join us every other Friday for more intriguing discussions of this very nature. You can find Damn on your favorite podcast platforms, and we'd appreciate it if you followed the podcast, turned on those notifications using the bell icon, and gave us a positive, but honest, rating while you're at it. To stay tuned into all things Northwest Hydro, you can follow us on social media at NW River Partners, and you can hop on our website, nwriverpartners.org. Until next time, see ya!